So let's get started with today's topic. We're going to take a deep dive into emissions and how it has affected our trucking industry and where this whole thing might be headed.
Tired of wet hands and feet? Never Limited Products has you covered when it comes to those long trips when you need to stay on the job and warm. Their 12-volt glove dryer sets up as easy as plugging it in. You can stick it anywhere and it will have your boots and mitts dried in under an hour. Never Limited Products, check them out.
So let's get started with some basics to get the ball rolling. Right on.
High five.
Okay, so first of all, just who the heck came up with the idea of emissions control?
Believe it or not, President Richard Nixon founded and established a branch of the government and called it the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Association. And the branch was assigned to do exactly what the name suggests. They were concerned about the mounting levels of pollution, so Nixon established this branch of government to help patrol and control and that type of thing. So the intentions, like a lot of things the government has done, the intentions were honorable, the intentions were good. So the EPA started in 1970 under Richard Nixon. By 1974, they had all their office furniture and everything set up. They were in their high rise, and they decided, well, we better start doing something to justify the funding. So in 1979, the EPA announced that they were going to start by regulating truck emissions, which all sorts of people felt was one of the biggest contributors to pollution. Now, I would have said big steel factories and pulp mills and stuff like that produce far more emissions than trucks, but there were just one whole hell of a lot of trucks on the road, so they decided to start with trucks. And being a branch of the government, the whole program didn't necessarily have to make sense. They just laid out the mandate and expected the engine manufacturers to comply, whether it was possible engineering-wise or not. So they just made the mandate, and they started patrolling. They started checking the trucks in 2002, and by 2004 they had begun their emissions program, and it was built in stages, and it would progress every few years. They'd clamp down a little harder and a little harder every few years.
What was the whole idea behind emissions control?
The idea was to reduce pollution from Class 8 trucks, from big heavy trucks, to improve the air quality in the country, in the United States. That was the goal. So they basically needed to make the engine manufacturers cut down on the black smoke that was coming out of the stacks of all the trucks all over the country.
Like in the Lettuce King's truck.
Especially in trucks like the Lettuce King's trucks, for instance. But yeah, that was their task. That was the first thing they tackled, really. By 2004, the engine manufacturers know that the EPA is serious, and they know that they're going to have to spend some serious money on research and development, because basically they needed to change the way the engine worked. The problem was, though, that the EPA decided, well, the engines can breathe in, but they can't breathe out. And when they breathe out, that's what goes up the stacks. It's unburned fuel or whatever, and carbon monoxide, all sorts of nasty things they didn't want in the air. So they mandated that the truck manufacturers, the engine manufacturers, were going to start squeezing down on what they would allow out of the stacks of the trucks.
Move on to how these regs have adversely affected our trucking industry.
So the EPA is just a government body, and like most government bodies, they really don't understand the science of what it is they're regulating. They're just an ideological body. They have a goal in mind. They figure this is the best way to reach the goal. This is what we're going to mandate. But the problem was they were mandating something that had more impact on the country than they ever initially realized. They thought it was going to be a simple deal, not nearly as complex as what it would become. And they never once, I don't think, looked down the road and looked at the ramifications, how this was going to affect the national economy and the bigger picture. They didn't look at the bigger picture. They just wanted less smoke out of the stacks. They didn't care how it happened, and they just knew they'd get more funding the more they made it happen. So all of a sudden you've got all these engine manufacturers trying to figure out how to redesign these engines so they don't exhale. And it was an engineering disaster because it affected the way the truck engine worked. But these manufacturers were mandated to this. So the whole emissions thing has been really destructive. It's been devastating for the trucking industry. But they show no signs of backing off. I think the whole thing was poorly implemented. I think they rushed it. I think if they'd given us, 50 or 75 years to develop the technology, we would have gotten there. But instead, they crammed it down our throats with these deadlines about when these emission standards had to be met, and it devastated the industry. Honestly, they found out that a lot of these emissions engines just plug up when they idle anyway. So it's probably a good thing if you don't idle a motor anymore. But that's not practical for a guy that's living in the truck. I guess you can go out and invest, $5,000 in an APU that may work or may not. But still, it speaks to the impracticality of the whole thing. It affected the produce industry, something huge, because here we're seeing a long-term effect of that now. Here I was looking at produce rates the other day, and produce rates last week from the West Coast to the East Coast of the United States, the average produce load was paying $10,000. And this is in off-season for produce. And the reason for that is because so many small outfits, single guys, independent, small outfits, hauled produce. And now guys like me, and there's thousands and thousands of us, just won't go to California anymore because they don't want the fines, they don't want the hassle. The reefers have to meet emission standards as well. The reefers are shutting off, the produce claims are huge, and a whole segment of our trucking industry just quit going to California because it just wasn't a practical business decision for us to continue to do that anymore. And now they wonder why the produce rates are so high, but that gets passed on to the consumer. So what happens there? Everyone is now going to pay more for groceries. All of the engines really performed very well before the EPA started having the manufacturers monkeying with them. Cummins was a top performer. Cat was a top performer. Even the Detroits at the time, which were ranked third, still built a pretty good engine when they went to the 60 series motor. And reliability, and you've heard me say this before, reliability is everything in trucking. And what was lost was this reliability factor when they started bringing in these emissions regulations. And trucking companies, this is interesting, trucking companies were buying spare trucks because their trucks are going down all the time. So they've got spares sitting in the yards, and they'll tow them out, swap them out with the one that's quit on them, and come, bring the other one back. But the little guy can't afford to be doing that. So there's how it affected small business trucking, for instance.
What were the developments by the engine manufacturers to engines to meet the emissions control standards? And how did the engine manufacturers manage with these imposed changes?
Well,
each of the individual? What if we tackle one at a time?
well, they've all basically done the same thing except for Cat. Cat bowed out of the picture, as we spoke to. International now, basically, they went with like an SCR valve system that didn't work. Now that basically brought them to their knees, and they haven't recovered from that since. Volkswagen's bought them out now, so it looks like they're going to breathe, which leaves Cummins in Detroit. So, and they basically are running the same system. They have a particulate filter that collects most of the crap, then it runs through a pipe, for lack of a better word, gets sprayed, the residue gets sprayed with DEF fluid or urea, and it goes into another tank, and what's left wafts out of the tank. So that's what Cummins and Detroit have got left to deal with. And they try like a regen system to try to cook the living heck out of the particulate filter to hope they can turn all that junk in there to ash. Cat has bowed out. International has basically gone broke and don't produce motors anymore because they couldn't. And Cummins and Detroit are struggling to make these DEF systems work, and with varied success. And the whole thing, they're all monitored with sensors and stuff like that.
Great comment, Michael Mueller. Manufacturers don't make money on engines that don't break down.
And that's, yeah, he's right. Well, I know that the dealership shops now are doing very well. Some of those guys are running $120, $130 an hour trying to fix these things. But most truck owners, after a while, have to say to themselves, you know what, that truck's in the shop more than it's on the road. I've had to refinance it twice just because of the cost of it breaking down, and I'm not going to do that anymore.
What have truck owners done to fight back and survive these imposed changes?
That's a good question. Truck owners, trucking guys are a resilient group. So they've come up with all sorts of workarounds that have yet to be shut down by the EPA. Probably glider kits was the biggest solution they came up with. And a glider kit is basically a rolling truck with no motor. So the guys would take an old motor, like a Cat or a Cummins, rebuild it and stick it in a brand new truck and have no trouble with it. And these things the glider kits were a great solution. They were selling like hotcakes, and now, of course, the government says, well, that's kind of a loophole. We better do something to shut that down because the emissions are still the same. We're not improving on the emissions. So there's a big fight in government to get rid of glider kits. But all sorts of other guys are just keeping their old trucks that they can fix and rebuild and just doing just that. They're running them closer to home. They don't run out to California and back anymore because they're worried about, the cost of breaking down, but they're more than prepared to run them medium distance and short distance. They fix them themselves. And at the end of the day, it's the truck owners that pay, and it's the public that pays. It's the taxpayer that pays. Your groceries have gone up. The cost of your new vehicle has gone up, but you're unemployed because they killed your job in the oil field, and it's on and on and on. It's just, I don't understand why they can't think this stuff through and do it gradually so it doesn't devastate everything.
Michael Mueller, wonder when Air Force One gets a DPF and a DEF.
Oh, you just know that Air Force One isn't running that kind of equipment. But
now what? What happens now? The development of electric trucks, is this the answer? Will it work? Why or why not? And how will this affect the company driver and the owner-operator? What do they do? How do they handle this?
Good questions. And they've been experimenting with other types of fuel, and you've seen them in the truck stops, like stations for propane and that type of thing, and natural gas, but none of those systems seem to be panning out for the trucking industry. So it's almost certain that the trucks of the future will be electric, and that's fine, but it's going to affect the industry all over the place. It'll pretty much, my guess is, it'll pretty much mean the end of owner-operators, because owner-operators, there just won't be the money in it to invest in a truck like that and then hope that you get enough work to pay for the truck. Like you'll save on diesel fuel, but there's nothing to say that every time you plug in your truck isn't going to cost you $1,000 to charge it up. Owner-operators will bow out. Company guys, not going to really affect company guys. It'll affect trucking, though, because the trucks won't be able to go as far. Like what we had in the 60s, where trucking companies had terminals all over the place. So you'd take it from one terminal to the next, and then the next guy would hook onto it, and then the next guy would hook onto it. So you're hopscotching across the country because of these electrical systems. Or they're going to need the truck stops to get on board and invest hundreds of millions of dollars in these charging systems, whether the state has the power grid to support them or not. So big trucking companies, it'll even change the way big trucking companies do business. A lot of them will look at the cost and the expense and say, you know, this just isn't worth our while. We're never going to get the stock market to invest in trucking on a break-even proposition. And with the cost of this new equipment coming down the pike, we're going to run out of investors. Lots of rich guys are investing in electric trucks, but they're not going to invest in trucking companies. So that's what's it's going to change. It'll change the face of the industry. At the end of the day, you know, 1,000 years from now, will the planet have cleaner air because of all this?
And there's no predictions to say that it will work.
And there's nothing to say that it's positive science that it is going to work. So whether it's all going to pay off in the end, nobody knows. Nobody knows. But we're all going to go through hell in the meantime. Thanks again for joining us. Take care. Keep the rubber side down, and we'll see you on the back haul. Good night, everybody.
Good night.